Okay, so I'm really excited to be speaking to you today at Logic Apps Community Day on this topic of transitioning from pro to low code with Azure Logic Apps. Now, this is a topic that's really important that I find, and it's something that I feel that pro code developers could really adopt and improve their overall tool set and their architecture and solutions overall if they were to adopt some low code. I just want to dispel any ideas about how I'm saying that pro code developers should become low code developers. What I'm really saying is that pro code developers could benefit a lot from taking some of the advantages of low code and integrating them into their everyday practices. And so the agenda for today's session, we're going to spend a few minutes just talking about quick introduction, the goals of today's session. Then we'll jump into, how can you as a pro code developer fit into this new or advancing low code landscape. Then we'll talk about Azure Logic Apps as our low-code tool and how we can take things that we already know as pro-code developers, implement them in low-code using Logic Apps. And then we'll jump into some demos. We'll spend most of the time there showing you how you can actually use Azure Logic Apps to implement a lot of the pro-code patterns that you already know today and leverage them directly in a tool like Azure Logic Apps. And then we'll have some final thoughts at the end just to kind of wrap everything all up. So who am I? So my name is Cameron McKay. I've been a software developer for the past 10, 11 years. I mainly do web development. I am a pro code developer at heart. I've written and developed a lot of enterprise scale web technologies or web applications, done a lot of cloud native Azure development, and I'm a strong proponent, an advocate for defensive programming. So security is at the forefront, OWASP top 10, all those fun things are things that we should all be thinking of as a pro code developer and also a low code developer, because all these things can leak into our solutions, make sure that security is at the forefront of everything we do. And so there's two goals that I have for you today. One is that I'm hoping that you will understand at the end of this presentation and throughout how you as a pro code developer can actually take the skills that you know every day and apply them in a low code situation or environment. The second being that I'm hoping that you can actually take the things away from this presentation through the demos and take it and implement things that you're learning, take your pro code knowledge and implement that in a low code environment. So let's talk a bit about, what is the trend? Like, what are we talking about when we think of low code and pro code? Well, really, there's this item that kind of came about where every software solution that we see today is pretty much a software as a service, a SaaS solution that exists. Things like Microsoft Teams, Outlook, these all exist as a standalone SaaS solution. And so there was a need. So typically we would develop with pro code and we would build these solutions where we'd be integrating, doing HTTP calls, like putting all these communications together to do integrations. And so the idea came around that, well, we can have citizen developers, we can have the business actually develop using low code and build things that allow us to implement these solutions together. The business already knows what they need to do, and so they can integrate and move data around with those systems. And so where does this leave us as pro code developers? How do we fit into this landscape? We're used to writing C# or .NET code. How can we actually live in this low code environment and also build things in pro code? So let's talk a bit about citizen developers and pro code developers. Where do we fall in this landscape? So in my opinion, citizen developers should be looking at building things using personal automations, so things just for themselves. They can build things and share them with their colleagues, so some close friends or some very close people within their organization, get some optimizations and efficiency there. They should be looking at things that are very low in complexity, so things that don't require a lot of manipulation. There's not a lot of business logic, very low risk items. That's where I feel citizen developers really shine, building those automations in low code or any platform, and basically integrating with those SaaS solutions and building in that way. So us, as pro code developers, where can we really shine? Well, we shine when we're thinking about not just a single person or a few people. We want to look at the entire enterprises. We want to look at entire departments. So we want to build things that will be used and will impact the larger organization. And we don't just want to look at things that are very low in complexity. We can definitely build those, However, the more complex, the harder, the more risk associated with building those automations and integrating with those SaaS platforms, that's when we should really be pulling in pro code developers. So if there's a lot of risk, say you're talking about finances, accounting, there's a lot of security involved, that's when you really want to involve pro code developers. And so if you think about, why do we actually have citizen developers? Why do we have low code? Why are we using these things? Well, as anybody who's existed in this industry for any length of time knows, the cost of writing custom apps is expensive. And through the adoption of citizen developers and low code, we could potentially remove some of these things. If the time and the cost of all those things kind of adds up, so if we can integrate low code into this, potentially we can improve our ability to compete with our competitors and deliver solutions quicker and for less cost. So to drive this point home, let's look at a few things that you traditionally do in pro code versus low code. So let's talk about HTTP client. This is a very common thing we implement in a lot of our applications, a lot of our integrations. In a pro code environment, you have to wrap the HTTP client library, you have to test it, you have to configure it. In low code, you literally just add the HTTP action and then off you go to the races. Look at another very common one. If we're sending emails through applications, we have to use the SMTP client. We have to wrap it, we have to unit test it, we have to configure it. If we're using low code, it's literally just there as an action available to us to leverage out of the box. And I could go on and on about various clients, Azure Storage Client, Azure Key Vault Client. There's a lot of these out there, and you have to follow the same practice in pro code, whereas in low code, you can just use it directly out of the box. So what if you, as a pro code developer, could leverage the skills that you already know in a low code environment? What if you could focus your efforts on design and architecture and integrate and create a hybrid of pro and low code together? What if you could take all that time saved and move it to something that would make your solutions more maintainable and reliable by adding additional testing and documentation? What if you, as a pro code developer, could deliver business value very quickly through pre-built connectors available to you in low code? Well, I'm here to tell you that Azure Logic Apps is available and can provide you all of those benefits. So let's talk a bit about Azure Logic Apps as our low code solution. So Logic Apps comes in two forms. We have consumption and standard. When we talk about these two various types, the way I like to look at it is consumption is a slice of the pizza and standard is the full pizza. So there's a lot of different functionality that's available to you in standard. Each of those slices gives you different functionality, different features that are available to you. And with consumption, you're kind of getting one slice out of that and you're able to utilize it. So let's just talk about standard. And the reason we'll talk about standard is because it allows us to have dedicated compute, which is important to us from a security standpoint. So if you have data security, you're going to want to make sure it's going through a virtual network. Make sure that you're using your own dedicated infrastructure. Standard is predictable in terms of the pricing of it. We're going to run on an app service plan, and therefore we can basically state that we're going to spend X dollars or very close to X dollars every month by running our Logic app in Azure. And the one key one that I think really drives home for pro code developers is that in standard Logic apps, you can have many workflows. And the reason I'm saying this is important because we're very used to following single responsibility principle as pro code developers, building different functions and reusing code. And standard is what allows us to do that through the use of many workflows. You don't get that functionality with consumption. And so to drive this home, why does standard hit the mark? Why do we want to use this? Ability to have it on its own virtual network gives us that security, which we really like. Predictable pricing is huge. That multiple workflows is also something that is really important for us as pro code developers. And then finally, the one thing that we're really here to talk about is this idea of hybrid pro and low code. And that's something that you can only do in standard. So if we look at kind of your basic Logic app infrastructure, so if we're talking about Azure and how this all works and things that fit together, you have your Logic app in the center. You're going to have a storage account. You're going to have logging with your app insights. You want to put your secrets in Key Vault, and then you're going to have your app service plan running underneath. So we talk about our development stack. So we're typically used to developing in Visual Studio Code, and we deploy into Microsoft Azure. We're going to use GitHub, GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps pipelines for deployments. And then our technology we're going to be writing our code in is Microsoft.NET and C#. So we can write any web solution, a console, desktop app solution, you name it, using this stack. This is what we're used to as pro code developers. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is not going to change very much if you move to a pro and low code development stack. The only thing that changes is you're going to be using VS Code, something you're used to. You're going to have Azure Logic Apps as your low code solution, and you can still write code using JavaScript and C#. You can still use Microsoft Azure as your deployment or hosting platform for infrastructure, and then you're still going to use GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps pipelines for deployment. So with all that said, let's jump right into a few demos. So here I'm going to show you some of the various use cases of how you can take things you already know from a pro code perspective and use them in low code. And so before we start here, for anybody who's brand new in a pro code mindset and you're coming into a low code environment, just want to tell you it's very simple and very easy to get started. You can create your first Logic app within seconds, and all you really need to know is this idea of there's going to be something that triggers something. And in a lot of the examples I'll be showing you, they're going to be HTTP triggers. So you can call it using any HTTP verb and have your workflow run as a result. You're going to have some kind of actions running underneath. And then because we're using an HTTP endpoint, we're going to have HTTP responses. So very similar to kind of a web kind of API that we're used to using as pro code developers. And so let's jump right into a few demos. So our first demo here is going to show you something you're very familiar with. And so we're used to writing JavaScript C# code. So we have here our intro trigger, basically saying, when we receive a request. This one you can use in all of your workflows. And here we have a response that I was telling you previously in another slide. So this will respond with a 200 HTTP status code. And the cool part that I want to show you in the middle here is you can do inline code as actions. So this here is an action available to you, allows us to execute JavaScript code. And so you can write whatever JavaScript code you need to in here. So if you're coming from a JavaScript background, this is available to you out of the box. You can just throw this in and you can do whatever you need to with it. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what's happening here. So here we're accepting a payload of an array of integers. We're taking that payload, we're pushing it into our inline code action. We're writing JavaScript. We're writing using the reduce function in JavaScript to sum up all of those integers in that array, and then we're returning the sum. So this will look very familiar to developers. Then at the end here, we're responding back to the caller with a 200 and the result of our sum. So something very familiar, something you're used to as a pro code developer. You're able to kind of see parallels here, exactly how you can leverage low code and pro code together. So going back to our slides, I want to talk a bit about scopes. And the reason I want to talk about scopes is because as pro code developers, it's really important for us to create and build things using SRP or using solid principles, single responsibility principle being the one that I want to focus on right now. We want to make sure that every scope, and so scope is a type of action that you can leverage, every scope has a single function. And if you do that, you can organize your low code into very modular, very reusable, and very readable function points. And so this should parallel things exactly to how you would think about functions in C# or even regions in C#. You're putting all the things that do specific functionality, do one thing into a scope. And I kind of like thinking of them as they're your best friend. Don't just throw a bunch of actions into your low code. Use scopes. They're going to make your life easier, and they're going to make the life of the next person looking at your solution much easier. And so we're going to look at one pattern that we're very familiar with in Pro Code, that being for error handling, that being the try catch finally pattern. And so look at what that would look like in low code. And the way we implement this is through scopes. And so you can see here, we have our trigger again, when we're accepting a request. And here we have 3 new actions that we haven't seen before. We have 3 different scopes available to us, and we've named these, try, catch, and finally. And so whenever I start building something, a new workflow in low code, I'm always going to come here, and I'm always going to put these 3 things in. And the way this works is just like you would in Pro Code, you put all of your functionality inside of your try, you put your error handling case inside of your catch, and then finally is going to be your cleanup. And so the way this is set up is we have our scope for try. If we click into our catch, we can go under settings, and we can see that catch is only going to execute if try fails, and finally is only going to execute if catch succeeds, times out, skips, fails. So it will always execute like you'd expect it would in a Pro Code environment. And you see if we expand these underneath, this is doing some kind of HTTP call. If that fails, it's going to come in here, and we're going to fail gracefully. And finally, we're going to do some cleanup here under our finally action. So the last demo I want to show you, and it's something that we've built recently, is we actually built an API using Logic Apps. So you could build these APIs using Pro Code, using Azure Functions, using .NET Web API, MVC, a lot of ways you could build these things. And so in our case, we built this API leveraging Logic Apps, and it was built as a stateless API, which allowed it to handle a lot of throughput that was coming at it. And this API was able to handle millions upon millions of requests, no problem. It scaled very well, and it essentially was a create endpoint, so post endpoint, where it was taking some form data and then pushing that into a data store. So I want to walk you through this API because I want to show you some of the practices and some of the things available to you and how you can actually hybrid and develop in both low code and Pro Code. So one of the first things I want to show you is input validation. And so input validation is something that's really important, especially if we're talking about security. And the reason for that is, if you ever attend a security conference or a seminar, the first thing, and the one thing you're going to hear them talk about a lot is never trust untrusted data. So anything coming at you from a form, from anything, you cannot trust it. You need to do something to it to make sure that there's nothing bad going to happen once you start actually executing, the real reason that you're calling that API or that endpoint is executing. So one mechanism that's available to us out of the box with low code that could take some effort to do in Pro Code is directly on our request action here. You can actually pop in a JSON schema. And so this follows all the conventions that you'd expect of JSON schema. Here we're validating, whether it's a string, we're validating things like what's the minimum and maximum length, whether it's a required property or not. And so there's a lot of information here that we're capturing, required fields. And so, anything you can imagine with JSON schema, you can validate here as well, and it will respond back with a 400 bad request. So that's really powerful and really useful. You can see we started with the try catch finally pattern here as well. Like I was saying, anytime I start doing development in low code, these 3 scopes go in before any other actions go in, and they're all configured as soon as they go in. So let's jump into this try. So you can see that we're using SRP here. We have 3 scopes underneath. The first scope is doing input validation very clearly. Then we are leveraging reCAPTCHA to prevent bots from just hammering this endpoint. And then we're saving something to a data store. So you can see it's very separated in terms of the responsibility of what's happening at each step. And if we jump into our input validation here, we have this new action available to us, which is call a local function from this logic app. And if we jump in here, you can see it's calling this function named input validation, and it's actually passing the input into here. And what's actually happening, if we click over to our Solution Explorer, is we created a Logic App workspace project that allows us to do custom code. And so over here, we have a C# class that is an Azure function, and it essentially will run locally on the same instance as our Logic App, and you can actually call this pro code directly from our low code solution. So what's happening in here, like I was saying, don't trust untrusted data. We're not doing that here because we actually wrote a C# function that is leveraging the HTML sanitizer framework available to us, recommended by OWASP, the OWASP Foundation, and we're doing some sanitization. So we're sanitizing whatever input came to us because we can't trust it. And then we're also doing some whitelisting in terms of the object. So submission, the input, we have a class defined below here with all these different properties. So once we have whitelisted this object, we know that nobody can do remote code execution, and then we can serialize it back and then return it back to the caller. So the idea with this is that we can leverage the best of pro code, which is doing the sanitization, or one of the examples of best pro code where we can use the sanitization, leverage libraries that aren't normally available in low code, do this kind of logic that isn't normally available in low code, and kind of combine them into one best of all solution. So we know that after we've reached this endpoint, or once we've reached this action and what comes out with that JSON, it's been sanitized. We can trust it. We can trust there's no injection happening. There's no bad nefarious things going on that we need to handle. And so now that we know that that's there, we can also leverage this really handy action, which is parse JSON. And just like the one I was showing you up there, you can pass in a JSON schema and you can validate all the information that's coming out of here as well, which is really powerful. And so we also have handling. So if either of these actions fail, we are going to respond with a bad request. So we have our response here and responding with a 400, our typical status code for bad request. Another really powerful ability with Logic Apps is you can actually short circuit the execution. So when you're writing pro code, you often have an if statement where you perform some kind of calculation, and then once you have the answer, instead of going through the full execution of your function, you can return early. But we can return early in low code as well. And we can do that using this terminate action. So this will terminate and fail the workflow, and we will make sure that we're not going to execute anything below here as well. So this is really powerful since we can short circuit and execute early or return early and not have to worry about all the processing below. We know that we're going to stop processing here because it's invalid. We shouldn't be processing further. And so we can move forward knowing everything is good after this step. So an example of a few control mechanisms that are available to you in low code. You can also implement these in pro code using the same Azure function piece that I was showing you earlier and call it from there as well. Just to give you an idea. So here we have an HTTP action, talking about HTTP client and wrapping that. Here, instead of doing that, we can actually just make calls directly using this action. We don't have to worry about configuration or testing or anything there. We know that this HTTP client has been implemented and it works. We can take the information back there and we can actually implement it and use it below. So here we have a condition, a series of if statements. This isn't pretty to look at, but it kind of facilitates the point to show you, what you can actually do. If you want to add conditionals, you can. Basically, we're checking the response from reCAPTCHA and then handling all the different types that come back from it. So you could also do this as a switch or an if statements in pro code as well and leverage that in the back end if you so chose. And just to complete this example, once we reach the end, we have the ability to save to a data store, and you can see we're leveraging the compose action. So this one's really powerful for doing printing things back, seeing the state of your running application. If you're doing a stateful workflow, or in my case, I'm doing a calculation. I want to see the date in the format of year, month, day, hour, minute, second, and then we are leveraging the SQL Server connector to allow us to insert information. So now we don't have to worry about configuring this so it can handle a lot of data or a lot of information. We know the SQL Server connector will work. And at the end here, you can see we're responding with success because everything went through. And here, if any errors happen, it's going to terminate with a 500. And you can see throughout this whole thing, the organization, the naming, it's all been set so that we're able to easily see and understand what's happening. So going back to my slides here at the end, just to provide some final thoughts. As you can see, pro code and low code as a hybrid is definitely possible, and there's a lot of gains from doing that. And here's a few numbers on the screen: 50, 10, 70. And really what we're saying, what's been said is that by Red Hat in 2018, low code platforms reduced app development time by 50%. True or not, I mean, it's 6 years ago, so it's very possible that this could happen, and it could reduce your development time by 50% if you were to leverage a hybrid development pattern. Forrester in 2018, said that it could speed up application development by a factor of 10. So there's a lot of advantage here to actually using a hybrid of pro and low code in your solutions. And then 70% of new businesses will use low code by 2025. So that's a year away. That was Gartner in 2021. So it really makes sense to start using low code as part of your solutions. And so to kind of wrap things up here, I hope that throughout this presentation and by walking through it with me, if you're a pro code developer or even a low code developer, you understand now, how you can actually take the information as a pro code developer and leverage it as a low code developer, or as leverage low code as part of your solutions. And then finally, if you wanted to, jump into it tomorrow or even right after this and start implementing things in low code, you would have that option available to you. So if you want to contact me, my email is here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And thank you, everybody, for allowing me to present this to you. And I really hope you found it valuable, and hope you have a great Logic Apps community day.